Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to deconstruct a pretty specific and, honestly, an increasingly open argument against democracy. We're going to trace it from the fringes all the way up to the highest levels of power, all based on the source material we've analyzed.
Okay, let's just jump right in with this statement. It's pretty shocking, but it's also incredibly clear, right? This isn't some coded message. It's a plainly stated political goal. Use one vote to end all voting.
And a quote like that really forces the central question we're tackling today. How in the world do you build and defend a position like that in public? What are the rhetorical tools you use? And what does the argument itself tell us about the larger project behind it?
So, to start, we're going to look at the most explicit, unfiltered version of this argument. It comes from a televised debate with a young conservative named Connor Estelle.
This right here is what our source material points to as a key saying the quiet part out loud moment. Estelle's confession gives us this raw, unfiltered peek at the playbook. It shows a mindset where democracy isn't the goal itself, but just a temporary vehicle. It's a tool to get to a very different destination.
So, to really get how these arguments work, we need to look at the specific rhetorical tools they use. Our source material identifies a couple of key concepts that really give this playbook its structure. First up is a core concept that Estelle himself actually brings up, and it's one with a very, very dark history. It's called the friend-enemy distinction. And what it does is it completely reframes politics. It's not about compromise or finding common ground anymore. Nope, it's a zero-sum conflict where one side has to totally, completely defeat the other.
And this exchange just perfectly illustrates the point. Estelle doesn't just use the concept. When he's challenged on its origin, he leans right into it. He embraces it. The source material really flags this as a key moment because it shows not just the use of an idea, but a conscious, stated indifference to its historical baggage.
Okay, here's another key tactic the text points out. It's a way of making a really extreme point sound kind of reasonable. It's a rhetorical bait and switch. You start on safe, defensible ground, the mot, like a castle's keep. You say something everyone agrees with, like, we must defend our national sovereignty. But then, from there, you advance to a much more radical position, the Bailey, like, say, the president's power cannot be questioned. When you get pushback, you just retreat back to the safe mod. So now let's see how this whole thing builds from a pretty fringe confession into a much more sophisticated, high-level political project. This is where the raw ideas get polished up and translated into a language that's a bit more palatable.
This comparison that our source text draws is just so powerful. On the left, you have Estelle's incredibly blunt ethno-nationalism, and on the right, a quote from Stephen Miller, using this coded language about preparation and values. The source argues these are just two different ways of saying the same exclusionary thing. It's a perfect example of moving from that controversial Bailey to what sounds like a defensible mot.
And we see the exact same translation again. Estelle's simple, one-word answer, autocracy, becomes Miller's restoring the republic. Our source material calls this a thought-terminating cliché. It's a phrase that's designed to sound patriotic and just shut down any further questions. So where does all this sophisticated language lead? Well, the source material connects it directly to Project 2025, which is this really detailed blueprint for governing. It pushes a supercharged version of what's called the unitary executive theory, which would basically concentrate an immense amount of power in the presidency, really dismantling the independence of the entire civil service.
And just listen to how the leader of the organization behind this whole blueprint describes the project. The language is stark, revolutionary. The source highlights that last part, if the left allows it to be, as language that really implies the outcome is already decided, and any conflict would be the fault of those who resist it. So what does the documented constitutional record actually say in response to all of this? The source text gives us a pretty detailed rebuttal, and it's based on court findings and the Constitution itself.
What our source provides here is a timeline of specific, documented challenges to the constitutional order. Each one of these events, from declarations that presidential power will not be questioned, all the way to firing independent commissioners, was tested in court, and in many of these cases, they were found to violate constitutional principles or established law.
To push back against that idea of unquestionable power, the source material offers this really powerful defense of constitutional principles. It's reconstructed from the perspective of the writer Christopher Hitchens, and it draws this incredibly sharp line between a president, who's a temporary officer bound by the law, and a sovereign, who is above the law.
All right, let's wrap this up by looking at the hard data presented in the sources.
We've heard the rhetoric, we've looked at the constitutional arguments, so what does the actual evidence show?
This number is pretty stunning. According to the source, the Heritage Foundation's own database on election fraud, which they compiled over 25 years, shows a proven fraud rate of 0.00003% out of 4 billion votes cast. This number is presented to put the rhetoric of a stolen election right up against the documented evidence.
So, after all that, what are the key takeaways? Well, first, that the playbook for this authoritarian project has been stated out loud, very explicitly. Second, that it uses these specific rhetorical tools to translate fringe ideas into more sophisticated political language. And finally, that when these ideas are actually put into practice, they get challenged again and again by the constitutional order, and they're just not supported by the available evidence. And this measurable decline is the real-world backdrop for everything we've been talking about. This slide shows an objective finding from the VDEM Institute. It's one of the most comprehensive trackers of global democracy out there. And this reclassification in 2024, according to our source, isn't a political opinion. It's the conclusion of a systematic global index based on hard data, and it shows the real stakes of the arguments we've been deconstructing.
So in the end, the source material doesn't just give us a simple yes or no. Instead, it leaves us with this huge, central, unresolved question. What it suggests is that the answer is still being written. But what it does give us is the evidence and the analytical tools to understand exactly what's at stake.